tatea vele mua le atua, ilona alofa, malona angalelei, e me whaina ma wha atasi lingei, wha potopotonga. Manuia le fuafuanga o le aso. 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and New Zealand's contribution to the global discussions was led by Te Taurama Whiri, the Māori Language Commission. 2021 to 2031 has been heralded as the Global Decade of Indigenous Languages. So our discussion today is an opportunity to raise some of the challenges and opportunities which might be facing the support, sustaining and revitalisation of Pacific languages today in New Zealand. Both of our speakers today are totally passionate about enhancing Pacific language speaking. Both are New Zealand born. One is a New Zealand born Samoan, Dr. Selena Law Wilson, and the other is Nick Mailau, a primary school teacher in South Auckland. And Nick is teaching in a mainstream class, and so he'll be coming from that perspective. So he, if you like, is sort of an emerging teacher in this field. So to open up our discussion today, perhaps could you just tell us a wee bit about what made you so passionate about Pacific languages?
Whaftai tele mo le awanua, ia whatalo whatu ma le anganga whaaloalo lava. I le pa ia ma le mamalu o whaafonga mamai mua mai. Malo lava le folau manuia, tātou vi ia I pele, le alofa ma le anga leo le atua. Talo whalava everyone. I grew up speaking Samoan as a first language in the home. And I learnt English when I started school. And this was a conscious decision that my parents made to ensure that us, the children, were able to speak our Samoan language. My father told me about how, you know, we were at the park when I was young and he met up with one of his friends and his friend said to him, you know, why are you speaking to your daughter in Samoan? You know, you should be teaching her English. She's not going to get anywhere without, you know, having the English language. And so I often look back on that and I'm grateful for the decision that my parents made because as we all know, maintaining our Pacific languages in New Zealand is a real challenge. It's not an easy task. But in terms of where my passion came from, I got the opportunity to learn Samoan further at university when I started at Victoria University. And it was during that time that I started to become more aware of some of the shifts that were happening, particularly, you know, with the Samoan language, but also Pacific languages in New Zealand, in terms of the rates of decline that I was not aware of beforehand. And so when I started doing postgraduate research at university, I started to see how rapidly the Pacific languages were declining. And those set off kind of alarm bells for me that, you know, what exactly is happening and how can we kind of reverse that language shift. And as I started to learn more about my own language, that passion started to develop a lot more. And I wanted to research further into how we could reverse that trend that we see with our Pacific languages in New Zealand.
I believe you started doing a law degree at Victoria, is that right?
I started studying law, but I was doing it at the same time as my arts degree. And when I graduated with my arts degree, I went back to law. But at that same time, I also started doing postgraduate research, you know, studies. And it was there that I started to see something that I felt was more important to me than the law degree that I was studying. And so I subsequently left law and went and pursued postgraduate studies because that was something that I felt more of a connection and a passion for.
Okay, Nick, tell us a bit about your story and how you became passionate about languages.
It's really interesting to hear what you said about you know, how there were other Pacific Island people saying, oh, why are you speaking Samoan when, you know, you should be focusing on studying English, when that was exactly the upbringing that I had, because my father is Tongan and he was insistent from a young age that me learning Tongan would be detrimental to my ability to learn English. And so, yeah, I wasn't taught Tongan at a young age. I can speak some phrases and some words now, but for me, I definitely felt growing up and still feel it now that there is a disconnect between me and my Tongan culture because I can't speak the language. I grew up in a house with many family members, aunties and cousins that I'm not quite sure I'm actually related to. You know how it is. I grew up eating all the food. I grew up doing all that stuff. Except of course there was always that sort of caveat that I can't actually speak the language. So as strong and as proud as I am to be a Tongan, there will still be that disconnect. One of the things that drew me to becoming a teacher was because I felt that as a Pacific male who, likes working with kids, I felt like it was my duty to become a teacher and to help that next generation maybe get some of the gifts that I wasn't afforded. So that's sort of, why I care so much about bringing the language back, and I'm still carrying on with my language journey as well.
So Nick, in your classroom today then, do you think your parents or your children's parents and the children themselves value their own language? Are parents still saying, no use at all, learn English, or has there been a change from your years when you were young?
I think, I can only speak on the very limited experience I have, only started teaching this year. I think, and obviously this doesn't apply to every single Pacific Island family, but when we have, parent-teacher interviews or we have student conferences or that sort of thing, the thing that often comes up with our Pacific families is, that's great, but how is my son or my daughter's English? And I think that is there is such an importance on, or this belief that if you speak English, if you understand English, that will get you a lot further than your ability to speak Samoan or Tongan or Fijian or whatever it is.
But are you using any Pacific languages in your classroom teaching, or any Pacific ways?
I definitely try to. My greetings, commands. I did Maori throughout high school, so I definitely speak a lot better Te Reo than I do Tongan. And so I try and incorporate that as much in my classroom. But again, that's something that, if I'm reflecting on my first 6 months as a teacher, that's something I know that I need to bring in, because, if a student brings me something and I say, whawhitai, is that enough? It's something, but is it enough? And I think that's the challenge that I'm continuing to face as a teacher. Yeah.
Thank you. And is there any movement in your school to have Pacific language sort of incorporated at all?
We're a very new school, and I would say that I would lean to the side of no. We have culture groups and stuff like that, but in terms of actual in-class acknowledgement or teaching of Pacific language, I would say very little of it.
Selena Law, if I said to you, what are 3 main important things why Pacific languages are valuable and important to Pacific students as learners, what would you say?
Well, I think the point that that Nick raised is a very important one about the perceptions that that exist around the lack of the valuing of our Pacific languages. Many still don't recognize the importance that our Pacific languages have, especially being bilingual, has in New Zealand. Of course, we value our languages for identity. They're the lifeblood of our cultures, intimately linked with spirituality. They're our, mea sina, they're our treasures. And people tend to understand that, I believe. But some of these perceptions that Nick was alluding to continue to exist because we don't, many don't recognize just how important our languages are here in New Zealand, that they do have value and that you can get a good job having, English and your Pacific language, that, English was always seen as the language of social mobility and success. But what we need to realize is that so are our Pacific languages, that they are important here in New Zealand. So we need to kind of change that narrative that I tend to believe is like a hangover of those colonial beliefs, that when our people migrated from the islands here, they were told, learn English, leave your language at home because this is how you'll survive in New Zealand. But now we know that our languages do have value.
To you both, what about in learning? If you speak to a child or develop a concept that you're trying to get them to learn and using their language, does that have any value at all?
There is that belief that, learning or speaking your native language will inhibit your ability to speak and write and listen in English, when actually, all the research will tell you that learning two different languages growing up is, gets your brain firing from an early age, and it actually helps you out a whole lot. Learning two languages is really, really good for your brain. Pacific navigators are the best we've ever seen in the history of our world. Their ability to, read the stars and use directions and get across the entire Pacific Ocean, was second to none. And so we know that inherently we have, these scientific and mathematical abilities. We don't promote the idea that actually Pacific people are some of the best scientists and mathematicians we've ever seen.
Building on from what Nick was saying, at the moment, we're probably not recognizing our students' multilingualism in the schools as best as we can. And, Nick was pointing to the fact that assessment and whatnot is based on a particular set of standards that doesn't necessarily allow for incorporation of other knowledge systems. And so we need to work towards finding a way to be able to acknowledge and also incorporate the multilingualism that our students do bring to the school. But the point I wanted to add on to just how important education is, we know that our Pacific families are losing their languages, and so education then becomes really vital in terms of our work to try and maintain our Pacific languages, and in some cases, revitalize the languages here in New Zealand, because we have, a fantastic start at the early childhood level with our, language nests across the different Pacific languages. But when we get to primary schooling, in particular, there's this gap. What we know from research is that languages need to be spoken across multiple domains in order to survive. But if children have a good start at ECE and then they get to primary schooling and secondary schooling and are not given the opportunity to use and learn the Pacific languages, then that's a significant amount of time and a place where there's that gap where they might be losing it.
So in your view, is there language loss, and how big is it? And are Pacific parents and communities aware of this?
There is clear evidence, Peggy, that our Pacific languages are declining. And as I mentioned before, they're declining rapidly. There's more accelerated rates of shift, specifically with Niue, Tokelau, the Cook Islands. Those languages have been termed by UNESCO as being, severely endangered. They're in a critical state. And if we don't do anything about it now, we're going to lose those ones very, very quickly. But all of the Pacific languages in New Zealand are showing shifts. And one of the key points I want to note about those statistics, Peggy, is that the 60% of our Pacific population in New Zealand are New Zealand born. And so that has, severe implications in terms of the future and the sustainability of the language, because it relies heavily on the New Zealand born population, considering we're the largest proportion. But what we do know from the statistics as well is that the New Zealand born population is losing the language the fastest, the languages. And so they become the critical group, specifically, in the younger generation. So it's also an awareness raising activity as well. If more people knew about what was happening to our languages, then, maybe that could shift some of the perspectives and, attitudes towards our languages as well.
Nick, were you aware of the decline?
Certainly not in a statistical sense. But I mean, it makes sense, right? Because my generation, of which there are a lot of people like myself who weren't taught their native language, we're now having kids and having families. So, if we ourselves don't have that language to pass on, then the language never gets passed on.
But I'm also going to go back to something which you have both alluded to, and it relates back to that saying by Aotearoa Whanafe, who said that when you lose your language, the light goes out in the village, because we're talking not simply language, we're talking culture, aren't we, as well?
Mm-hmm. It's very hard to separate language and culture. They're intertwined. And so, what Whanafe says, I believe, is very true, that embedded within language are, our histories, our genealogies, myths and legends, how we do things in our cultures. They're all encapsulated in the language. And so when we lose those languages, we lose all that comes with it as well.
Where do you think is the best place to start learning the language?
I'm a big advocate for beginning in the homes. I think, in our families, that's, there's a Samoan saying that our parents are our first teachers. And so, what happens in the family, not only do you start learning there, but you learn, the socialization of children happens within the family. I do also acknowledge that, families are struggling to do that here in New Zealand, and that families need help. Not all families have fluent speaking parents in the Pacific languages. So that's where it becomes a more of a collaborative effort, where the schools, the communities, the churches work together to try and maintain our languages in that way.
But you have signalled before that there is ECE, Aonga Amata. There's nothing at primary school, is that right? Is there a missing gap in the schooling chain?
I think those who are fortunate to be able to go to, primary schooling where they have bilingual units, or, where they have immersion programs within the primary schools, are very fortunate, but that's not widespread across New Zealand. So there is a gap in the schooling in terms of, both teaching languages, but also being able to learn in the languages. At secondary school, you can learn, some of our Pacific languages as a school subject, and also at university. But again, it depends on where you go to.
I remember seeing those subjects, offered in the NCA handbook, but my high school didn't have it, so I didn't have a choice. Which is, I think, why I was drawn to studying Te Reo Māori, because I think that you're right, Peggy. There is a missing link in that chain, and for me, it's the same sort of difficulty we have with implementing compulsory Te Reo Māori in our schools, and that's that we don't have enough teachers that speak the language. And as well as that, we also need our school leadership and our principals and our deputy principals
on board.
Yes, especially our Palangi or any other cultures, to say, hey, these are actually really, really important. And then when that happens, then you have more kids that grow up, feeling like their culture is valued, and then maybe they become teachers, and then the next generation really benefits.
Yeah.
So
Selena Law, you talked about language shift before, and I'm going back to the teaching of Pacific languages in schools in New Zealand today. There's sort of a little bit of an argument or a debate. Should we be teaching what I will call the absolutely correct, say, Samoan language in schools and insisting on the spelling and the glottal stops and the word order and those sorts of things? Or is it better at this particular stage that we look also at a more colloquial language which is known and understand? Should we also be aiming for that? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, like you say, it is a debate. I mean, in terms of language teaching, there are various different methodologies and pedagogy for teaching languages, and in the past, it's been the kind of thinking behind it has been, that very heavily grammar focused way of teaching language, that it is about learning the grammar of the language. Which is kind of is shifting now. And many language teachers are looking more towards what, kind of what you were referring to, a more communicative approach, so that the learners are learning the language needed to be able to communicate, rather than learning the grammar of a language. So, and we know that in the community language settings as well, that there are different, levels. Some want to come in and learn that very basic level, being able to communicate, just having enough language to be able to do that. Whereas others might come in and want to learn, more advanced kind of level Pacific languages, so they can operate in those different contexts within in the Pacific cultures. We're seeing, especially in the second generation, third generation, coming, those who were the children of those first migrants, the ones that lost the language because of some of those things we were talking about earlier. We're seeing kind of this rejuvenation of language. Those are the people who are coming back to learn the language, because they want their children to be able to have, their Pacific languages as well. So we're kind of seeing that shift occurring as well. So it's not just about those who are, born here in New Zealand and in young, but you're seeing some of the children of those earlier migrants now coming back to learn, because they want their children to be able to, to have the language as well.
Okay, that's a very important point, because when you look at the data, there's been quite a huge increase in the number of what I will call mature, like 40 upwards, who are now parents, who are joining those classes.
Since COVID, we've been able to really utilize technology a lot better across all of our, workplaces. But, for example, PEC is delivering, those language classes online now. So, without having to physically be in a classroom, there is now, using IT and the internet, some of that language learning is now becoming a lot more accessible to families and communities if they have, a good internet connection. We start seeing the value of being able to be multilingual in New Zealand and in the jobs that we're working in, then that hopefully that will solidify the idea of how valuable our Pacific languages are.
We've sort of have always followed the Maori example and strength, if you think about it, and that's at a peak at the moment. And I know that the New Zealand government has given quite a significant amount of money to Pacific languages in a policy this year as well. So the floor is open. Is there something that we have missed in this initial discussion that you would like to sort of just raise before we go?
it's still very much, I think, on us as Pacific Islanders to push for that importance and not wait for it to come to us. And if we look at the Kupu app, which was designed, I think, with Spark, where you can take a photo and it has a word, it takes one Pacific Islander or a few technology minded Pacific Islanders to go ahead and do something like that. for Samoan language or for Tongan language or for any other Pacific language. And, we have those tools at our disposal. So we really need to, do the mahi and start doing it.
Are you using those tools in your classroom?
Yeah, we use the Kupu app all the time because the kids will do anything to take photos of stuff. You give them an iPad and you say, here you go and take some photos of stuff, and they'll do it for hours and hours. So, kids are curious, right? And kids want to know a lot more about themselves, especially if they are Pacific Islanders. So
I think the point that Nick makes is a very nice one to end on. It's about recognizing our own strengths within our communities, that the expertise in terms of our own strategies for revitalizing and maintaining our languages lies within our communities. But also, with the support that we do get from government, like I mentioned before, it is a collaborative effort.
Well, whawhate to you both, and God bless your future efforts. Yeah. Whāsoi fua.
Ka tai lava, tangaloa.
mahalo.